The gulls were arguing over nothing when he almost walked past it. At first, it was just another dark shape in the gray-blue dawn, half buried where the tide curled back on itself. Then the next wave rolled away, and he saw the curve of a hull, the flaking white paint, the ghost of black letters along the side. A lifeboat, old and wrong for this coast, leaned in the surf like it had crawled ashore overnight. He stepped closer, heart tightening, and through the broken slats inside, something small and metal caught the first light in his breath. Most mornings, Elias walked this stretch of beach without really seeing it. The routine had worn itself into him over years. Wake before the sun, coffee too strong in a chipped mug, boots on while the kettle still hissed. Then the same narrow path through marram grass to the sand. He liked the shoreline best when it was empty, when the town behind him was still quiet, and the sea sounded like the only honest thing left in the world. His life was tied to that water in ways that felt both simple and impossible to explain. He ran a small trawler out of the harbor, nothing fancy, just enough winch power to haul the nets, just enough engine to outrun bad weather if he saw it in time. On good weeks, the catch paid the fuel and left a little over for groceries, repairs, and the slow, creeping costs of an old house with salty bones. On bad weeks, he reminded himself that his family had survived worse. His grandfather had worked these same waters, though in black and white photographs, the harbor looked almost like another world. Men in wool caps and heavy coats, boats low in the water with cod and haddock, faces weathered in a way that had nothing to do with age. There was one picture of his grandfather that his mother kept in a drawer rather than on the wall, standing on a wharf beside a larger ship, its name just out of frame, smiling in a tight, uncertain way. That ship never came home. The story, when anyone dared to tell it, was simple and short. A storm farther out than the coastal boats usually ventured, a distress call half heard through static, then nothing but weeks of search, and then, eventually, a plaque added to the row of names at the harbor memorial. But the part that lodged under Elias's skin was not what was said. It was what was always left out. His grandfather had survived that wreck, or so the oldest rumor went, only to disappear again years later. Nobody could agree on how. Some said another storm. Some said he'd gone looking for something or someone and never returned. His mother would tighten her jaw if the subject came up and change it quickly. As a boy, Elias had felt the silence around that shipwreck like a wall in the house. He'd sit on the harbor rail and stare out where the water darkened toward the horizon, trying to imagine the shape of a ship swallowed whole. Sometimes, on nights when wind clawed at the windows, he'd hear older fishermen at the bar talk about strange lights offshore, a glow where no boat should be, the echo of a horn in fog so thick you couldn't see your hand. By daylight, those stories became jokes. By daylight, everyone trusted the charts and the buoys again. Still, the ghosts clung to the coast. The harbor had its line of memorial plaques, brass polished by salt air and fingertips, each one a name and a year and the barest hint of a life. Elias's grandfather's name was there, though the date beneath it was the year of the first wreck, not the year he actually vanished. Whenever Elias passed it, he felt like the metal was telling half a truth. He had learned not to push his mother for the other half. Some grief, he'd realized, settled into people like sand into old wood, too deep to pull out without breaking something. Even so, he kept listening. He listened when older men mentioned an incident offshore in the same breath as that missing ship. He listened when someone at the bait shop lowered his voice to say, "They never told the full story of who got off and who didn't." Those fragments never quite fit together, but they left a shape in his mind. A night of panic, lifeboats swinging out, choices made in the dark that nobody wanted written down. He carried that with him, unspoken, each morning as he walked the shoreline. That was why, when he saw the lifeboat lying awkwardly in the surf, his first feeling wasn't curiosity. It was recognition. Sharp and inexplicable. He stopped a few paces away, boots sinking into wet sand, and let his eyes adjust to the dull dawn light. The boat was bigger than the dinghies locals used, with higher sides, the remnants of a painted name along the bow. Most of the letters were peeled and scarred by time, but enough remained to tug at something in the back of his mind. A sequence he'd seen once, somewhere. Maybe on the edge of that old photograph. Wind pushed a thin sheet of foam around the hull, making it scrape softly against the sand, like a tired thing catching its breath. No one from the harbor had mentioned the lost tender or a training exercise. There had been no storms lately, strong enough to throw wreckage this far. Elias glanced up and down the empty beach. No footprints but his. He told himself he should call the harbor patrol, report it as debris. Let someone official handle it. But his gaze kept returning to the glint inside the boat. The flash of metal among the shadows and broken wood. Something about the rounded shape, the way it rested as if it had been placed there, made his skin prickle. The sea gave things back sometimes. Lost buoys, driftwood, the occasional crate. This felt different. This felt like something the tide had reluctantly released. He stepped forward, one hand reaching for the lifeline along the gunwale, the other reaching toward that gleam in the dim interior, not yet knowing that within minutes, the quiet mysteries of his family's past would no longer stay buried offshore. He braced one hand on the gunwale and hauled himself up, the wet wood cold beneath his palm. Up close, the age of the lifeboat was impossible to ignore. The planks along the side were split and furred with fibers, as if they'd swollen and shrunk 1,000 times. Rust bled from every bolt and fitting, running in frozen streaks toward the keel. The rope threaded through the lifeline cleats had rotted into stiff gray cords that snapped when he tested them with 2 fingers. He swung a leg over and stepped carefully inside. The hull creaked under his weight, not dangerously but in protest, like a floorboard in an old house that remembered too many footsteps. Sand had settled in the bottom in uneven drifts, mixed with crushed shell and the pale ghosts of barnacles that had once clung to the outside. Here and there, small crabs scuttled away from his boots, resentful at the disturbance. The thing that had caught his eye sat wedged against the forward bench. It was a metal locker, no bigger than a carry-on suitcase, bolted directly to the seat supports. Salt had eaten away most of its paint, leaving only patches of dull gray and a hint of navy blue. The hinges were clogged with corrosion, crusted thick, as if the sea had tried to weld it shut. He crouched, heart beating harder than the effort required. Plenty of boats carried emergency gearboxes, but this one felt different, deliberate, important enough to secure to the boat itself. A part of him whispered that he should leave it alone, that whatever lay inside belonged to someone else, or to the ocean, or to the past. But another part, the same stubborn curiosity that had driven him to stare at that harbor plaque as a boy, wondering about what was never quite said, pushed his hand forward. He tested the latch. It didn't move at first, locked in place by rust and time. He tried again, this time with his full grip. Metal groaned, then snapped free so suddenly his knuckles slammed into the lid. A sharp sting shot up his hand. He swore under his breath, flexing his fingers, then slowly raised the top. The smell hit him first, not rot. Whatever had been in there had been sealed better than the boat itself, but an old, closed-in scent. Oil, paper, metal. Like the back room of the harbor office, where nobody bothered to dust the ledgers. Inside, the contents were few but precise. A brass compass lay in a shallow indentation of foam, its casing greened with age, the glass fogged in one corner. Even beneath the tarnish, it had a certain weight to it, the kind that came from careful craft rather than mass production. On its back, almost erased by corrosion, were tiny, engraved letters. He squinted, wiping gently with the edge of his sleeve. The first word snapped into focus. The name of a ship he knew by sound alone, from whispers and half-told stories. The same ship connected to his grandfather, to the photograph in the drawer, to the plaque that never sat right with him. His mouth went dry. Beside the compass lay a tight bundle wrapped in darkened oilskin, edges cracked but still mostly intact, and a small tin box barely larger than his palm. The tin bore no markings he could see, just dents and a ring of rust where a paper label might once have clung. Elias stared at the items for a long moment, the wind blowing thin spray over his shoulders. He imagined an officer logging this as marine debris, tagging the lifeboat, hauling it away to some fenced yard beyond town. The compass and the papers might end up in a cardboard box, misfiled, forgotten. Whatever fragile thread connected this boat to that old shipwreck and to his family could be lost again. Swallowed this time not by water, but by bureaucracy. His thumb traced the ship's name on the compass, feeling each letter like a bruise. He closed the locker, then opened it again, as if expecting the contents to vanish. They didn't. The decision he'd been avoiding settled on him with the weight of wet clothes. He lifted the compass first, cradling it in his palm. It was heavier than it looked. The needle twitched faintly, as if trying to remember which way was north. Carefully, he set it in the deep pocket of his jacket. The oilskin bundle came next. The material crackled when he picked it up, stiff with age but still held together. Whatever lay inside was flat, flexible. Papers, he guessed. Maybe charts or logs. He resisted the urge to tear it open right there. The tin box he hesitated over longer. Something about its unmarked surface felt more private, almost intimate, as if it contained a piece of someone's ordinary life, rather than official record. A wedding ring, perhaps. A photograph. A key. He slipped it into his other pocket, feeling suddenly like a thief in broad daylight. When he stepped out of the lifeboat, the sand felt less solid under his boots. He scanned the horizon again. Still, no one. Just the slow pulse of the sea and the distant shapes of gulls, wheeling lazy circles above the harbor entrance. He told himself he was only taking the items home to keep them safe until he knew what to do, until he could read whatever was sealed in that bundle and decide who, if anyone, ought to see it. As he walked back along the beach, the compass knocked gently against his side with each step, a small, insistent reminder that, for the first time, the mystery that had haunted his family for decades had given him something tangible to hold. By the time Elias reached his kitchen, his hands had stopped shaking, but the rest of him hadn't caught up. He set the compass, the oilskin bundle, and the tin box on the table as carefully as if they were explosives. The room felt smaller with them there. The hum of the old refrigerator, the ticking clock, even the distant thud of waves against the seawall. All of it faded behind the pulse in his ears. He started with the bundle. The knots in the oilskin had stiffened into hard lumps, but they yielded under patient fingers. When the last loop slipped free, he eased the cover back. Inside, several sheets of paper lay folded together, edges browned, ink feathered in places where damp had seeped through. He unfolded the top page. It was a passenger list, or part of one. Names marched down in neat columns, some crossed out with a single line, others marked with hurried notes in the margin. A faint printed heading across the top showed the ship's name and the date she'd sailed. The ship from the compass, the ship from the rumor, and the photo his mother kept hidden. He traced the date with one fingertip. It matched the year on his grandfather's memorial plaque. Halfway down the page, his eyes snagged on a surname he recognized immediately. Not his own, but close. A variant he'd seen on old letters in his mother's handwriting. Cousins from another branch of the family tree. Beside it, in a different hand, someone had written a single word. Transferred. His throat tightened. He turned to the next sheet. This one looked different. Not a list, but a letter. The script slanted across the page in dark, looping lines. At the top, a salutation. To whoever finds this, or to the family I cannot reach. He read slowly. The writer described the night the ship was struck by the storm. Lightning, sudden wind, the tilt of the deck, officers shouting, lifeboats swinging out half-manned. In the rush, some cabins were never reached. Others were emptied twice. The letter wasn't polished. It rambled, doubled back, corrected itself. But certain phrases cut cleanly through the years. We launched with more seats than people. But when we pulled away, there were still faces at the rail. Some of us were put into Lifeboat 3 by name, as if someone had decided in advance who should have a chance. I don't know if it was mercy or guilt that chose that list. Elias read that line 3 times. At the bottom, just before the ink faded completely, the writer had signed a full name. The middle name was the same as his grandfather's. The surname matched that variant from the list. This wasn't just any account. This was someone tangled directly in his own family's roots. He looked up, staring at the pale square of window above the sink. Outside, the sky had brightened to a washed-out blue, but the light felt wrong, too thin. The official story had never mentioned lifeboats. He folded the pages back along their original creases and slid them carefully aside. The tin box sat where he'd left it, stubbornly quiet. He left it closed, one mystery at a time. The compass, now resting on its back, seemed to stare up at him with its fogged glass eye. Around the edge of its casing, beneath the corroded engraving, faint numbers were stamped. An identification code. If anyone else in town could tell him exactly what that meant, it would be the archivist. Elias shrugged into his jacket again, the pages tucked into a clean envelope, the compass in his pocket. He hesitated with the tin in his hand, then put it back on the table. He couldn't explain that one yet, not even to himself. The local archives were housed in what had once been a customs office, a stone building just off the harbor with narrow windows and a bell that never rang. Inside, the air always smelled faintly of dust and salt, like an old book left too close to an open door. Mara was behind the front desk, as she usually was on weekday mornings. Years of tracing other people's stories had given her a kind of patient alertness. She looked up as he came in, surprise flickering across her face, before she covered it with a small, familiar smile. "Twice in 1 month," she said. "You'll ruin your reputation. People will start thinking you read." He managed a weak smile back. "Don't tell anyone." She watched him a beat longer, then tilted her head. "What are you really looking for today, Elias?" He placed the compass on the counter between them. The brass looked dull under the fluorescent lights, but the engraved name caught her eye. Her joking expression faded. She picked it up gently, turning it toward the light. "That's not something you find at the flea market," she murmured. "Where did you get it?" "Washed up," he said. "In a lifeboat that doesn't belong here." Her gaze sharpened at the word lifeboat. "From that ship?" He didn't answer directly. Instead, he slid the envelope across to her. "There's a partial passenger list in there. And a letter. I need to know how much of the official story you have on record. Ship's logs, newspaper clippings, the inquest." He hesitated. "Anything that mentions lifeboats being launched." Mara's eyes flicked from his face to the envelope, then back. She saw more than most people when they looked at him. Tiredness, yes, but also the thin thread of urgency running under his words. She nodded once. "Come on." The back room was lined with gray metal cabinets, and shelves bowed under the weight of binders. Mara moved like someone who had spent enough time among them to know where ghosts slept. She pulled out a drawer labeled with the ship's name, then another marked simply with the year of the storm. They spread the contents on a wide table. Yellowed clippings, copies of maritime board findings, grainy photographs of search vessels lined up along a rain-streaked quay. On paper, the story was neat. Caught in a sudden, violent storm. Last radio contact garbled, but enough to confirm distress. Debris later found far offshore. All hands presumed lost. Inquiry closed within a year with phrases like "act of God" and "unavoidable tragedy." Mara flipped through the copies, frowning. "Here," she said, tapping one article. "Early report from a coastal station. It says, rescue launches deployed after receiving indication that lifeboats were successfully lowered." She slid another clipping beside it. "And this one, 2 days later. Initial reports of lifeboats unconfirmed. No explanation. The mention just disappears. She pulled a photocopy of a handwritten log from a small folder. Look at this. A fishing crew 40 miles north logged seeing a light low on the water the night after the storm. Thought it might be a lifeboat, but by the time they turned toward it, it was gone. Elias swallowed. The direction matched the stretch of coast where he'd found the battered boat that morning. Mara leaned back, studying him. You didn't just wander in here because you were bored. He met her gaze, the weight of the envelope between them. No. Are you going to tell me, she asked quietly, what you really pulled out of the tide today? His first instinct was to deflect, to say he'd only found the compass, that the rest was speculation. But the papers on the table, the gaps in the record, the echo of that word transferred on the list, they all pointed the same way. He exhaled slowly. Not everything, not yet. But I can show you the boat. 1. Mara's fingers rested lightly on the compass. For a moment, she seemed to be weighing something unseen. Then, she closed the folder of clippings with a decisive snap. All right, she said. Let's go see what the sea decided to return. By the time they reached the beach, the tide had begun to slip back, leaving the sand slick and dark. Mara walked a few steps ahead, collar turned up against the wind, one hand resting on the strap of her bag as if to steady herself. When she saw the lifeboat, she stopped without needing him to point. That, she said quietly, isn't from anything that's been in our harbor in my lifetime. Up close in full daylight, the boat looked even more out of place. Its lines belonged to another era. Higher bow, heavier ribs, the faint curve of where canvas covers might once have stretched over metal hoops. The painted number along the stern was almost gone, but not quite. Mara stepped closer, brushing sand away with the edge of her sleeve. There, she murmured. See that? The ghost of a 3. Elias squinted. Under the scabs of peeling paint, the shape was unmistakable. 3, followed by letters he could not entirely make out. His pulse quickened. Lifeboat 3, he said. Mara nodded slowly. It matches the notation in that letter. Put into Lifeboat 3 by name. She traced the faint numeral again, as if confirming it by touch. They circled the boat in silence for a moment, taking in details. Along the hull, scrape marks ran diagonally, deeper in some places than others, as if the lifeboat had shoved against something harder than water, rocks, or another hull. Near the bow, someone had driven a makeshift patch over a long crack, the boards reinforced from within by an extra plank and old bolts. This wasn't just lowered and lost, Mara said. Somebody worked on it after the fact, tried to keep it going. Elias ran his fingers along the inside of the gunwale, feeling for what his eyes might miss. Halfway along, on the inner plank, his fingertips snagged on something shallow but deliberate. He leaned closer. Carved into the wood, almost erased by time and wear, were 3 initials. The middle one matched the letter writer's first name. The last one was a surname he knew far too well. He didn't speak for a long moment. When he did, his voice sounded strange in his own ears. That's my family's name. Mara bent to see. Her eyes widened, the wind lifting a stray strand of hair across her face. You're sure? I've sanded enough net shed doors to know how our letters look, he said. My grandfather used to scratch his initials into everything, even the handle of his favorite knife. Mara straightened slowly, taking in the lifeboat as if it had shifted shape. Then someone from your family was in this boat, she said. Not just on the ship. Here. After the storm. The idea settled over him heavier than the gray sky. For years his grandfather had been a story blurred by rumor. Now, suddenly, the wood at his fingertips carried a direct mark, proof that he hadn't vanished in some abstract way. He had sat here, hands numb, knife blade biting into damp timber while waves slapped the sides.
Mara stepped back, eyes distant.
"Let's try to walk through that night," she said. "Not the neat version on the inquiry pages. The version these boards remember." She gestured toward the sea. "The storm hits, power fails. They get the lifeboats swung out, but not all of them, not evenly. The letter says some cabins were called by name." She glanced at him. "Your family name's among them." He imagined the deck washed in emergency light, the tilt underfoot, his grandfather's brother, or whoever wrote that letter, carrying a list or shouting into wind. Faces pressed toward the rail. Some turned back to help, others froze. "Lifeboat 3 goes down clean," Mara continued. "Enough time to grab a compass, some papers, whatever the officer in charge thinks they'll need if they're found. They hit the water with more seats than people. They pull away and see others still on deck." "And someone carves their initials," Elias added quietly, hand still on the wood. "Later, maybe, when the storm eases and they realize they've survived the first part." "Hello," Mara nodded. They row through the night. The log you showed me mentioned heading toward a distant light. That could have been a village up the coast, an old settlement. He frowned. "There's nothing much north of here now. Just dunes and that abandoned inlet." "There used to be more," she said. "Fishing hamlets that died when the harbor deepened. One of them had a chapel. I've seen it in old maps." She glanced back toward town, already calculating. If Lifeboat 3 made for that light, it might have come ashore near there. Elias thought of the letter's uneasy line about mercy or guilt deciding who went into the boat. "If some of them survived," he said, "why didn't they come back? Why does every record say all hands lost?" Mara was quiet for a moment. The waves hissed softly along the sand, filling the space between them. "Maybe," she said slowly, "they did come back. Just not here. Not as who they were before." She looked at him. "If you were pulled from the dark while others you loved went under, would you want to walk into a town that had already carved your name into a plaque?" He thought of his mother's tight jaw, the photo in the drawer, the way she never quite said whether her father had left or been lost. Guilt and grief could twist together until they were indistinguishable. Mara crouched again, her hand brushing the interior plank. "The second document in your bundle," she said. "You said it was more of a log than a letter. There was a line about position and about seeing shelter." He nodded. "Last known bearing, then. Will attempt for the northern shoals." She stood, eyes bright despite the flat light. "The northern shoals line up almost exactly with that abandoned settlement. If we go there, we might find something. Records, names, even a photograph. Proof that whoever climbed out of this boat stepped onto land somewhere." Elias looked from the lifeboat to the horizon, where the sea and sky blurred into the same pale strip. For years, the night of the storm had existed for him as a single, fixed point. A tragedy beyond reach. Now, the pieces were starting to move. A compass with a familiar name. A list with transferred scratched beside a cousin's surname. Initials in old wood. A mention of lights on a forgotten shore. "Then we follow their route," he said quietly. "We see where they went when they left this boat." Mara gave a small, firm nod. "We let the paper trail catch up to what the tide has already told us." They stood together for a moment longer beside the lifeboat, the wind tugging at their clothes, both of them listening. To the surf, to the gulls, and to the faint, imagined echoes of oars in the dark, pushing away from a sinking ship toward a shoreline that no one had thought to mark on any official map. The road north ran out of asphalt before it ran out of land. Elias's truck bumped along the last stretch of rutted track, scrub grass rasping against the undercarriage. To their right, the sea kept pace, a flat band of pewter under a low sky. Mara watched the dunes ahead, an old survey map folded on her lap, edges softened by years of use. "It should be just beyond that rise," she said, tapping a point inked in faded blue. The charts listed as Harrow Cove. Nobody's called it that in decades. They crested the dune, and the landscape fell open. What remained of the settlement was more absence than presence. Low stone outlines marked where houses had once stood, square shadows sunk into the sand. Here and there a chimney still poked up alone, useless without the rooms that had once pressed around it. A collapsed jetty jutted from the shore at an angle, timbers half buried and furred with seaweed, pointing out toward nothing. "Looks like a mouth with missing teeth," Elias said quietly. They parked beside what might once have been a lane. The wind carried the faint tang of old tar and something like smoke, though no fires had burned here in years. Grass pushed through cracks in the remaining flagstones, patient and indifferent. Mara led the way toward the one structure that still had most of its walls. A squat, rectangular building near the waterline, its roof sagging but holding. A rusted bell bracket clung to its gable, empty. "Chapel," she said. "Or meeting hall. These places usually kept their records somewhere dry. Or dry-ish." The door was gone. Inside, sand drifted in waves across a stone floor. A few broken benches lay in piles, wood, gray and splintered. At the far end, beneath a small, cracked window, stood a narrow table on its side. Beside it, half hidden by a tumble of plaster, sat an old trunk bound in iron. Elias moved toward it, heart thudding. The hasp had rusted through long ago. He pried the lid up. It resisted, then gave with a protesting screech. The smell that rose was dry and papery, with an undertone of mold. Inside, a jumble of ledgers, loose papers, and a leather-bound book lay in disorder, the top layers curled and brittle. Mara's eyes lit with a cautious kind of excitement. "Community records," she breathed. "We might get lucky." They carried the trunk into the strip of light near the door and began sorting. Some pages disintegrated at a touch, but others held. Guest registers from holiday seasons long past. Handwritten notes about catch quotas, births, deaths. A list of donations to repair storm damage. "Here," Mara said suddenly. She held up a thinner book, its cover stamped with a simple cross. Inside, the neat hand of some long-gone clerk had recorded services. Weddings, christenings, funerals. In the back, a few pages were marked visitors. The entries there were fewer, but one caught her eye. The date matched the week after the storm that had taken Elias's grandfather's ship. "Received 6 souls from sea," she read aloud. "Arrived by boat, condition poor. Names given as—" She trailed off, eyes scanning the list. Elias leaned in. The first surname was unfamiliar, the second too. The third made the back of his neck prickle, a near match to the variant he'd seen on the passenger list in his kitchen. "Spellings drift," Mara said, almost to herself. "Especially when people are cold and half-drowned, and being written down by someone who hears an accent they don't recognize." The fourth name froze him completely. It wasn't his own, but it might as well have been. One letter different from the way his family spelled it now, and the given name. The same as the one his mother had never quite explained when she mentioned a distant cousin who'd turned up after the war with nowhere to go. He swallowed. "That one," he said. "My mother used to talk about someone with that name. Said he came from over the water and that it was complicated." Mara's finger traced the line. They stayed here for nearly a year, according to this. Then the entry stopped mentioning them. No note of a departure, just silence. She reached back into the trunk and pulled out a small, cloth-bound photo album, its spine cracked. The first few pages showed the settlement in better days. Boats lined along the shore, children clustered on the jetty, women in aprons squinting at the camera. Near the end, the images grew fewer and more haphazard. On one page, a photograph had been glued in crooked. The edges had browned, but the scene was still clear. A lifeboat sat on the shingle, its bow angled toward the water, the number on its stern just visible. 3. A small group of people stood around it, some wrapped in blankets, others still in heavier coats. Their faces were blurred by age and the motion of the original shot, but certain shapes persisted. Broad shoulders, the set of a jaw, the way one man's hand rested protectively on the shoulder of the person beside him. Elias leaned closer, breath caught. One of the blurred figures wore a cap, tilted in a way he recognized from that drawer photo at home. The stance, the angle of his head as he looked away from the camera. It wasn't proof, not the kind Mara could cite in a paper, but it hit him with the force of recognition. That could be him, he whispered. My grandfather. Or his brother. Here, not at the bottom of the sea. Mara didn't contradict him. She studied the image, then the notation written beneath it in fading ink. Strangers from the wreck, given shelter. She flipped to the inside back cover of the album. A few loose slips of paper were tucked there. Lists of supplies distributed. Notes about which families had taken in which of the Seacom as temporary boarders. One margin note in a different hand read, "One man left for town down coast. Says he has kin there. Told to take a new name, as his is already carved in stone." Mara glanced up. Down coast would be here, she said quietly. Your harbor. The air in the ruined chapel seemed to shift. The space between past and present narrowed. Elias pictured it. A man stepping off a cart or a small boat into the town he'd left behind. But now as someone else, facing people who believed him dead. Or choosing not to face them at all. Slipping into the edges of the place. Distant cousin becoming easier to say than ghost returned. He sat back on his heels, the stone floor hard beneath him. So they didn't vanish, he said. They diverted. Came ashore here, stayed, scattered. Some went north, some came home under a different story. Mara closed the album gently. Which means your family has been living with a half-truth for a very long time, she said. And they're not the only ones. Every name on that passenger list that matches a name here, those are threads that were cut short in the official record, but continued quietly in places like this. He thought of the other families in town who brought flowers to the memorial every year. People who might have kin buried not in the sea, but up here, in unmarked soil, or in ledgers nobody had opened in decades. The wind blew through the broken window, stirring a scrap of paper on the floor. It skittered toward him. He pinned it with his fingertips, then picked it up. It was a note in the same hand as the margin comment. Must forget, it read, or we'll all drown on dry land. He folded it carefully, his jaw set. Forgetting had been their survival then. Remembering, he realized, might be the only way for their descendants to breathe properly now. He looked at Mara. We need to take copies of all this, he said. Bring it back, not just for me. Have ever, she nodded. For everyone whose stories got left offshore. As they carried the trunk toward the door, the ruins of Harrow Cove seemed to watch them go. Not resentful, just relieved that someone had finally come to listen. They drove back in near silence. the trunk of copied records and photographs thumping softly in the bed of the truck with every bump in the road. Mara held the chapel ledger on her lap, one hand resting on its worn cover as if afraid it might vanish if she let go. Elias kept his eyes on the narrow strip of asphalt ahead, but his thoughts were already turning toward a smaller street, a smaller house, and the person inside who had spent a lifetime dodging the shape of this story. He dropped Mara at the archives with a promise to return the next day. "Make copies of everything with those names," he said. "Not just mine." She touched his arm before getting out. "You don't have to do this today." He shook his head. "If I don't, I'll find a reason not to." The house where his aunt lived sat 2 streets back from the harbor, its paint worn thin by salt and years. She'd never married, never moved far from the water, and never quite forgiven the sea for what it had taken, or for what it might have returned. She opened the door before he could knock twice. "Elias," she said, surprise folding quickly into wary affection. "You look like you haven't slept in a week." "Maybe I haven't," he answered. "Can I come in?" She stepped aside, studying his face the way people do when they sense a storm but haven't yet seen the clouds. The living room was small, crowded with things that carried memories more than value. Framed landscapes, a shelf of chipped mugs, a sideboard with a lace runner. On the wall, above the gas heater, hung the same photograph his mother kept hidden in a drawer. The one of his grandfather beside the unnamed ship. Here, it was in plain sight. His aunt noticed his gaze. "Your mother never did like that picture," she said. "Too many questions in it." "That's why I'm here," he said. "About the questions." He sat at her table, the same one where he'd eaten biscuits as a boy, and laid out the envelope with the passenger list, the letter, and a carefully protected photocopy of the chapel page. His hands felt clumsy against the delicate edge of the paper. She didn't reach for them immediately. Instead, she watched him, her mouth a thin line. "What did you find?" she asked. "A lifeboat," he said. "This morning. Washed up north of town. Old. Wrong kind." Inside there was a compass from his ship, a passenger list, a letter from someone who signed with our middle name. Only then did she pick up the pages. He watched her eyes move, quick despite the years, taking in dates, names, the scrawled notes in the margins. When she reached the line about Lifeboat 3 and the phrase about seats chosen by name, her fingers tightened. By the time she reached the Harrow Cove entry, the 6 souls from the sea, the nearly familiar names, her shoulders had sagged. She set the papers down with great care. "So," she said, her voice roughened, "you finally found the rest of it." "You knew," he said quietly. She closed her eyes for a moment. "Bits, pieces. Not like this." She tapped the ledger copy. "We had only what people were willing to say. And most of them were too tired or too ashamed to say much at all." He waited. "When the news came that the ship was lost," she said, "your grandmother changed. All the light went out of her at once. They put his name on that plaque, and she stood there and watched them do it. But the body never came back. No wreck, no debris we could recognize. Just words." She glanced at the photograph on the wall. "Months later," she went on, "a man arrived. Not at the house, your grandmother would have fainted, but at the edge of town. Stayed in the boarding house, then the net sheds. Folks said he was a cousin from up the coast. He had your grandfather's way of walking, his laugh. But he signed a different name in the ledger. Said his family had been lost in a storm and that he had no one left." Elias pictured the note from Harrow Cove about taking a new name, because the old one was already carved in stone. "Grandma knew," he said. His aunt nodded, eyes glistening. "Of course she knew. But what do you do when the world has already held a funeral? When the town has already organized itself around your loss? If she said this is him, what then? People would have asked why he hadn't come back sooner, who else he'd left behind. Why he was in a lifeboat when others were not. She swallowed, the words scraping their way out. So she let him be a cousin, she said. Let him sit at the table sometimes. Let him bring you sweets when you were small. Let him grow old in the same streets without ever having to explain why he survived when his brother did not. Elias felt something inside him twist. Part anger, part pity, part a strange, aching relief. You all carried that, he said. All this time, we carried what we could, she answered. The rest sank where we couldn't see it. She touched the letter again. The line about mercy or guilt choosing who climbed into Lifeboat 3. Your grandfather's brother gave up his place, she said softly. That's the part nobody wrote down. He pushed him toward the rail, told him to take care of his wife and whatever children came after. He stayed on the ship. That's what he told me once when he'd had too much to drink. Then he made me promise never to repeat it. The room seemed to narrow around the table. So his silence wasn't indifference, Elias said. It was all of that. She nodded. Grief with nowhere proper to go. Guilt that didn't belong to him but settled on him anyway. He thought if he stayed quiet, the pain would stay small. It didn't. They sat with that for a long moment. Finally, she looked up, her gaze sharp again. Why are you showing me this now? Because the lifeboat came back, he said simply. Because there are other names on that list. Other families who have been visiting that plaque for years, thinking their people vanished completely, when some of them washed up in places like Harrow Cove and tried to start over. His aunt's hand hovered over the papers. If you tell them, she said, it will open everything. Old wounds, old questions. Some will be grateful. Some will be angry. Some will say we lied. Did you? He asked. She thought about that, then shook her head. We survived. Sometimes that looks the same. He leaned forward. I'm not looking to blame anyone. I can't unknow this. And I don't think it belongs only to us. The archivist thinks we could bring people together, show them the records, let them decide what to do with it. His aunt looked toward the window, where a slice of harbor showed between curtains. A gull crossed that narrow sky, its cry thin. For years, she said slowly, I've walked past that memorial and felt like I was visiting two graves. One for the man we lost at sea, and one for the parts of him we buried here on purpose. Maybe it's time other people knew they have graves like that too. She turned back to him, eyes clear despite the redness at their edges. If you do this, she said, do it gently. No speeches about heroes or cowards. Just tell the truth as you found it. Let folks see their own faces in it. Will you come? He asked. She hesitated only a moment. If you're asking me to sit in a room while you drag all our ghosts into the light, I suppose someone ought to be there to point out which ones belong to us. He smiled. A small, tired thing. Then I'll talk to Mara, he said. We'll organize something at the hall. Keep it simple. As he gathered the papers, his aunt reached for his hand. Elias, she said, whatever people decide about this, I'm glad you didn't just let that boat be hauled away and forgotten. He squeezed her fingers back. Feels like it didn't wash up by accident, he said. No, she replied. Some stories float until someone's ready to carry them the rest of the way. The notice went up in the most old-fashioned way possible. A handwritten sheet in the window of the harbor hall. A few quiet phone calls to people who still checked their landlines. A mention at the end of the Sunday service, the pastor clearing his throat as he read the words, gathering of families connected to the, and then the name of the ship that had hung over the town for decades, like a low cloud. No one called it a meeting. No one called it a ceremony. On the paper, in Mara's careful script, it was simply an evening to share what the sea has returned. The night they chose was clear but cold, the kind of weather that made the harbor lights look sharper than usual. Elias arrived early, carrying a canvas bag that felt heavier than its contents. Photocopies, the chapel ledger, the photograph of Lifeboat 3 in Harrow Cove, the letter from the lifeboat itself. Mara was already there, setting up a portable projector and arranging chairs in uneven rows. "You still have time to run," she said lightly when he came in. He shook his head. The tide's already turned. His aunt arrived not long after, her coat buttoned to her throat, jaw set. She gave him a look that said both, "I'm here," and "Don't make me regret this." Slowly, people filtered in. Older men who'd worked the same grounds as their fathers and grandfathers, caps in hand. Women who came with folders of their own. Family Bibles, old letters. A few younger faces, too. Grandchildren who'd grown up hearing only fragments, drawn more by curiosity than by grief. At the back, near the door, someone had hung a framed rubbing of the harbor memorial plaque. The names shaded in soft graphite. It seemed to watch over the room, silent but present. When the chairs were mostly full and the murmur had settled, Mara stepped to the front. "Thank you for coming," she began, her voice steady but gentle. "We know some of you are here because your families were directly touched by the loss of the—" She spoke the ship's name, and a ripple passed through the room. "Others are here because this harbor keeps its stories close. Because what happens to one crew never really belongs to one family alone." She glanced toward Elias, then moved aside. He had never liked speaking in front of groups. The last time he'd stood at that front table, it had been to argue about quotas, his voice rough with frustration. This was different. The words he carried now felt more fragile and more necessary. He rested his hands on the edge of the table, grounding himself. "This morning," he said, "the sea pushed something onto the beach north of town. A lifeboat. Old. From a ship we all know by name, even if we've tried not to say it out loud too often." A hush fell. Someone in the front row sucked in a breath. He told the story in simple lines. How he'd found the battered boat at dawn. The compass inside, bearing the ship's name. The oilskin bundle. The letter from Lifeboat 3 describing that night in the storm. The rushed evacuation. The seats assigned by name. The faces left at the rail. How the writer had signed with a name stitched to his own family. He didn't dramatize. He didn't need to. The pauses between sentences carried enough weight. Mara clicked the projector on, and a faded document appeared on the wall. The passenger list. The notation transferred beside certain names. A few people leaned forward, lips moving as they traced familiar letters. "We compared these papers," Elias went on, "with what the archives already had. The official record says all hands were lost, but early reports mentioned lifeboats. A fishing crew logged seeing a light low on the water north of here, the night after the storm." Mara changed the image. The screen showed the chapel ledger from Harrow Cove, the entry about 6 souls from sea taken in after a wreck. She zoomed in on the column of names. "They came ashore at a settlement that doesn't exist anymore," she said. "Harrow Cove. They stayed there for a while. Some left. One note says a man went down coast to find kin. Told to take a new name because his old one was already carved in stone." You could feel the room leaning toward that line. "Down coast," Elias said quietly, "means here." He told them about the photograph they'd found in the ruined chapel. Lifeboat 3 on the shingle, the blurred faces, the number visible on the stern. About the initials carved inside the boat matching his family. About the distant cousin who had arrived in town one day with his grandfather's walk and someone else's name. The projector image changed again to the photograph. There were no gasps, only a kind of collective inhalation, shared and held. "My family isn't the only one caught in this gap," he said. "There are other names on these lists that match surnames in this room. People who've been told their grandparents or great-uncles vanished in the storm. Full stop. when some of them washed up on a different shore and tried to start over. He stepped back slightly, giving the space to them. Mara spoke then, not to lecture, but to connect dots. She pointed out how the chapel record lined up with dates from the inquiry, how the settlement's notes about Seacombe guests mirrored missing lines in the maritime logs. She was careful not to claim certainty where there was none. Instead, she offered possibility. "These records don't rewrite what happened," she said. "The storm was real. The losses were real. But they widen the frame. They show that the story didn't end entirely in the water. Some threads continued on land, in places and under names that the official narrative never bothered to follow." Hands went up. Questions came, not as challenges, but as people trying to fit their own family fragments into this new outline. "My grandmother always said her brother left by boat and never came back," one woman said. "She never would say which boat. My father used to talk about a stranger who lived in their shed for a winter," an older man added. "Said he carried a compass he wouldn't let anyone touch." Elias's aunt spoke up from her chair near the front, her voice quieter but no less firm. "We did what we thought we had to do to keep breathing," she said. "Some of us accepted men into our homes under borrowed names. Some of us kept photographs in drawers. Some of us went down to that plaque every year and cried for both the ones who didn't come back and the ones who did, carrying more than we knew how to share." Her gaze swept the room. "If this hurts," she said, "it's because it matters. But it's a different kind of hurt than the not knowing." Silence followed, dense but not suffocating. In that space, an older woman in the second row stood up, clutching a folded piece of paper. "My family name's on that passenger list," she said, voice shaking. "We always thought he just disappeared. If there's a chance he stepped onto land somewhere, even if he changed his name, I'd rather know that he walked a little more of his life than think he went straight under." A murmur of agreement moved through the crowd. Heads nodded, some slowly, some with sharp conviction. Mara cleared her throat. "We can't give anyone a perfect map of what happened," she said. "But we can give you what we've found. Copies of records, photographs, notes. We can add names to where the story had only numbers before." She gestured toward the back of the hall, where a long table had been laid out. On it, the lifeboat's photograph stood in a simple frame. Beside it, the compass rested on a folded cloth. The chapel ledger copies were stacked neatly, each packet held together by a clip. An empty sheet of paper at the end bore the heading, "Additions to the Harbor Memorial." "The Harbor Board has agreed," she said, "to update the plaque. Not to erase what's there, but to add a companion marker. One that acknowledges the lifeboats, the survivors who came ashore in places like Harrow Cove, and the lives that continued in quieter corners of this coast." A few of the younger faces exchanged glances. "What would it say?" someone asked. Elias looked at Mara, then back at the room. The answer had been forming in his mind all day, though he hadn't put it into words until now. "Something like," he said, "for those taken by the sea, and for those the sea returned changed. For the choices made in the dark that were carried in silence, so others could live." No one spoke for a moment. Then, slowly, people began to stand. Not to leave, but to move toward the table. Fingers reached for the copies, for pens to write names they'd only whispered before. A few paused at the photograph of Lifeboat 3, tracing the blurred figures as if they might step into focus. Elias stepped outside for a moment, needing air. The harbor lay quiet, boats rocking gently in their berths. Up on the bluff above the tide line, the lifeboat he'd found that morning had been moved and set on wooden supports, its warped hull cradled instead of abandoned. A temporary rope barrier encircled it, a handwritten sign flapping in the breeze. "Lifeboat from the wreck of," followed by the ship's name. "Understudy. Please respect." He walked up the path until he stood beside it. In the wash of the street lamp, the carved initials inside the gunwale caught the light. The boat no longer looked like a piece of wreckage. It looked like what it had always quietly been. Evidence that people had fought to live, that they had rowed and patched and carved their names into the world, even if they later chose to let those names drift. Behind him, the sounds of the gathering floated out of the hall. Low voices, a few muffled laughs, the scrape of chairs. Not the noise of a town reopening an old wound, but of people carefully examining a scar they'd inherited, and finally naming how it came to be. The sea, beyond, went on breathing in its slow, endless way. For the first time in a long while, Elias felt like it was exhaling something back that the town was ready to catch.